Hello YouTube, Sidekick here with a bit of a different video this time. I'm not flying in any particular aircraft today. Today I wanted to talk about flying, or rather simulated flying, in general. Fair warning, this is a video that is aimed mostly at new or even prospective players rather than old hands. If you're a veteran flight simmer, then please feel free to follow along and leave your own constructive advice in the comments, but understand that I'm probably talking about stuff you already know. Because what I want to talk about today is really kind of the state of flight simming, why things have changed a fair bit in the last few years, and what that might mean for someone who's thinking about getting into, let's call it the hobby. I use the word hobby advisedly because it really is a pastime that goes well beyond simple gaming, I think, because it can be something that will suck up your interest and your funds over time as you purchase new aircraft and upgrade your virtual cockpit, which is something we can talk about a little later. But first, let's talk about what's changed and why that might make a difference to someone new to flight sims or someone who's thinking about giving it a try. Before we start, let me just tell you where I'm coming from. I'm pretty much a lifelong flight simmer, or at least as much of my life where that has been a possibility. Bearing in mind that my first computer that I owned was a VIC-20. Yeah, you can look it up. And that wasn't until I was in high school. But suffice it to say that since there have been simulated flight experiences available, I have been avidly experiencing them. I've forgotten all of the different incarnations, but they have been, as they say, legion. I should also say that I do have some pilot training in real life, having earned a private pilot's license at the tender age of 16. I actually had a pilot's license before I had a driver's license. It was not something that I was able to keep up with for a variety of reasons, and so my logbook has about 50 hours of flying time from about 40 years ago. But, all that aside, what has been happening in the world of simulated flight? Well, along with the normal increase in the quality and fidelity of simulation that goes along with an increase in computing power available, there really have been what I think are two kinds of disruptive events that have occurred in the last few years that have made a real difference. The first of these is the advent of the clickable cockpit. For most of the last 40 years, flight sim controls were bound to key or button presses. If you wanted something to happen, you had to remember which button or key to press. Want to raise or lower the gear? Well, that has been the G key for a long time. Raise your flaps? F. Lower your flaps, V, and that's because V is below the F on the QWERTY keyboard. Eventually, we started getting controllers that had enough different buttons that we could bind these commands to a button instead of a keyboard key. But then the simulators and models kept getting more and more complicated, and invariably there would be some commands that couldn't be bound to buttons, and so a keyboard was usually required for at least some commands. This meant that it was difficult for new players to just jump in the cockpit and go fly, as you continually had to pause the game to find the keybind you were looking for, while also trying to take off or land or dodge those incoming missiles. So it was really not an ideal learning environment for the novice. So when, and I think it's fair to attribute this to Digital Combat Simulator by Eagle Dynamics, when flight simulators started to implement clickable cockpits, the game really changed. A clickable cockpit just means that the buttons and switches in the cockpit are interactive and can be selected, pressed, flipped, or rotated using your mouse. Now, instead of remembering a keybind, if you want to do something, you can just reach out and touch the control there in front of you, just like a real pilot would do. This makes the whole flight sim experience much more accessible for new players, especially when, for instance, Microsoft Flight Simulator will actually provide you with a checklist that will highlight the switches as they need to be thrown. For whatever reason, learning the layout of an actual cockpit is much easier, at least for me, and I think most players, than memorizing a bunch of unrelated keybinds. The second development that has improved the flight sim experience is, let's call it, natural viewing. This started with simple 2D head tracking, probably 10 years ago or so, and has now progressed to full 3D VR. The ability to move your point of view in the game by simply moving your head was a huge leap forward. Again, because it makes the experience much more natural, it really eases the learning curve. Back in the day, before you had head tracking, you had to use one set of buttons to move your viewpoint and another set of buttons to control the aircraft. Once again, it could be done, even done quite well, but it needed a lot of practice. But as much of an advance as 2D head tracking was, VR is much, much more. I won't go into it here because I have another video that discusses it in detail, but VR really has changed the game entirely because it truly places you in the cockpit and removes a layer of interpretation that goes on in your brain when you're looking at a 2D screen that your brain really doesn't need to go through when the information is really in 3D. It's also important to realize just how impressive the increases in computing power over the last few years have really been in contributing to improving flight sims. Of course, the most obvious effect is the quality of the graphics, with the current state of lighting, shadows, and volumetric cloud scenes that have become virtually photorealistic in some cases. Along with that, the increased computing power has allowed for much more detail and high-fidelity flight models. It used to be that a Cessna 172 kind of flew like an F-16, only, a lot slower. Now each aircraft has its own particular performance envelope, and at least according to some real-world pilots, the performance of some aircraft is getting pretty close to what they experience when they actually fly. All of which is to say that modern programs like Microsoft Flight Simulator and DCS, as well as like the IL-2 franchise, are not, as the saying goes, your father's flight simulators. They really do offer a much more accessible, immersive, and high-fidelity experience than they did even a few years ago. If you're interested in getting a sense of what flying a real airplane is like, modern flight simulators will get you much closer to that experience than they ever have before. I would say that they're even good enough that if you want to learn how to fly an aircraft, then they'll allow you to develop and practice some of the basic skills that you'll need. Which is not to say that a flight sim is a replacement for a professional in a real aircraft, because they're not. But I do think that they've gotten to the point where they can be, and in fact are used, I think, by some flight schools for what is called part task training or procedural training. So they really are worth a look. The big question is that how much is this hobby going to cost you? Accessibility in terms of the learning curve is one thing. Accessibility in terms of drain on your wallet is another. The good news here is that the sim itself, meaning the actual software, is going to be quite inexpensive. In fact, if you decide you want to try DCS, you can basically do it for free right now. The DCS model is that the sim itself is free and comes with a couple of aircraft for you to try. Now, these aircraft are not full fidelity in that they don't have clickable cockpits, and they're not the easiest aircraft to fly. A wide variety of full fidelity aircraft are available for download from the DCS store, and they range in price from about $50 to about $100. But the real secret to DCS is that there are several very good free mods featuring aircraft that are fully clickable and quite fun to fly. If you really want to get your teeth into a flight sim for free, you could do a lot worse than downloading DCS and the A29, T45, and A4 free mods. Both the A29 and the T45 are trainer aircraft. The A29 is a turboprop and the T45 is a jet. They're fairly easy to get in the air and learn to fly, and their cockpit systems are not overly complicated. And they will also both allow you to drop bombs and fire rockets. Now, the A4 is a faithful representation of the Vietnam-era mainstay of the U.S. Navy Light Attack Force. It's less complex than modern fighters, but it includes all of the major aircraft systems and a very detailed flight model, and it'll keep you busy for a while if you want to. If instead you want to go the Microsoft Flight Simulator route, things work a little differently. The cheapest version of the standard edition will cost you around $65 US, I think, but it comes with 20 different planes, from simple single-engine piston aircraft to huge jetliners. All of the included aircraft have fully clickable cockpits, and there are several that are well suited to being used as trainer aircraft. In fact, the list of aircraft includes the real-world aircraft that most real-world pilots actually learn to fly in. So, in terms of software cost, I think it's fair to say the initial cost of a flight sim it's pretty modest. But, of course, the software isn't the whole story. In order to really enjoy the flight sim experience, you need to have some hardware, too. First of all, you're going to need some form of controller. And this is where the discussion gets kind of interesting. Before continuing, let me declare my bias right up front. I grew up flying military flight sims, and so I very much favor the stick in my right hand, throttle in my left kind of controller arrangement, and that's what I'll focus on mostly here. You can, of course, also go with the more civilian style yoke in your left hand, throttles on your right arrangement as well. Some might even be tempted, at least in Microsoft Flight Simulator, to try using a game controller, but honestly, this isn't an arrangement that I'd recommend if you're interested in a flight simulator. For me, if you want to experience a simulation of what it's like to fly a real-world aircraft, then you will want controls that at least mimic how real-world controls work, and I just don't think some thumbsticks are the way to go there. So I'm going to talk about the joystick and throttle approach. In order to get a really decent simulated experience, you need a control setup that has at least 4 control axes. You need one each for roll, pitch, yaw, and for throttle. It is possible to get all of this in one joystick if you get one that has a twist grip for yaw and a slider on the side for the throttle. And there's a variety of makes and models available, and often for under $100. As I said, this will get you started, but you'll probably want to move up to a more stick and throttle or HOTAS, hands-on throttle and stick combination pretty quickly if you spend any time in the sim. Basic HOTAS setups can be had for somewhere between, say, $100 and $250. Now, the low end of these will feature pretty basic build quality, fewer buttons, and less programmability, but they will be functional. The upper end will feel more solid in your hands and will likely include some extra axes and some more programmable buttons. If you want to move up to the high end, then you can go really up to the sort of prosumer grade throttles and sticks, like the Thrustmaster Warthog or products from manufacturers like Winwing and Virpil. Now, these setups will cost you in excess of $500, and are definitely not worth it unless you decide this is a hobby that you'll be spending a lot of time on. Eventually, though, if you get serious, this is going to be where you end up. It's not just the build quality, which is much, much better than the consumer grade. It's also the fineness of the control that the systems offer, especially if you start adding things like stick extension to the joystick to give it a more realistic sort of throw. I have both a Thrustmaster Warthog and a Winwing joystick, both with desk mounts and 10 centimeter stick extensions, and I would not fly any other way now. They just provide smooth control through their whole range, and they give me a nice, precise control of whatever aircraft I happen to be flying. Now, in addition to controls for your hands, the other thing that we should talk about is the point of view tracking, and there really are 2 options here. As mentioned before, you can go with 2D head tracking, or you can go with VR, and I'm not going to talk about VR again because there is a separate video, and you should go take a look at that. But you really are going to want some form of head tracking. As I said back in the old days, before head trackers became available, and you had to move your view around with buttons on a joystick, it was highly non-intuitive. And it led to a lot of frustration until you got really good at it. So I would say there is really no way that I could fly a flight simulator without some form of head tracking. And I would really recommend getting or building a head tracker if you're going to get into flight simming. Now, I say or building because the fact about head trackers is that the one that is really commercially available, at least that I'm aware of, is TrackIR. And it's frankly pretty expensive for what you get, coming in at around $100, and it never goes on sale. But it is possible to build your own head tracker using a USB camera and some free software and basically a printer. I have to admit that it's not what I use because I still have my TrackIR from 10 years ago, and I haven't ever actually tried to make it work, but I have looked at it a couple of times. Lots of people do report very good results for an outlay of probably less than $25 and a bit of time setting it up. So, with all that said, what's the bottom line? I'm going to say that you could probably get yourself a control setup to get yourself started in a flight sim for under $100. This would be the very most basic 4D joystick and a do-it-yourself head tracker. It can be done. It's probably not a long-term solution, though. I think if you end up deciding to spend any significant time in a flight simulator, you'll probably end up spending between about $200 and $400 for a decent control setup and a head tracker. So all up, For software and hardware, you could be in the virtual air for under $100, and you could have a system that will do everything you want it to do for somewhere between $250 and $500 probably. The one other 800-pound gorilla in the room, of course, is what kind of hardware do you need to have to run a modern flight sim? And, well, now, as with any discussion about computer hardware these days, this is bound to find many folks with many different opinions. I can only give you mine. The one thing that I can be definitive about is that the biggest driver of cost of a flight sim setup is going to be the resolution of the monitor. And I really don't believe that more than 1080p resolution is necessary. Going to a higher resolution is going to rapidly increase the demand on the CPU and GPU in your system. So the key to being able to fly on a modest rig is definitely avoiding higher resolutions. Over the past few years, I've been using an ultra-wide monitor for my flying, and I've always liked that screen size, although you can certainly fly on one or maybe two monitors of regular form factor. Now, since there are an awful lot of permutations and combinations of processors and GPUs out there, let me just tell you what has worked for me. With the 1080p ultra-wide monitor, I was able to get good results in DCS. With a system that started out with a Ryzen 5 2400G processor and an RTX 2060 Super graphics card. And in fact, I was able to run medium to high graphics settings with that rig. So I'm convinced that you could have a decent experience even with a system that's a few years old. If you're buying new components, assuming you can get them, I think you can still have a pretty decent experience with a mid-range CPU and a mid to low-range GPU. Anything that compares well to that 2060 Super is probably going to be just fine. Now, stepping up from there is going to allow you to run at higher graphic settings and to get better frame rates. And I should say that this discussion really only refers to flying in 2D. If you want to fly in VR, you are probably going to want a more capable system. My current main rig runs a Ryzen 7 5800 and an AMD RX 6800 graphics card with a 1440p ultra-wide monitor. It also handles high graphic settings in DCS and Microsoft Flight Simulator just fine. But in fact, I upgraded from my old system primarily for better performance in VR. In fact, I still use the old system to fly in 2D, and it still performs very well at 1080p resolution. So what's the very, very, very bottom line? Do you want to find a flight simulator in your stocking for Christmas this year? Obviously, I'm biased, but I really do think you do. The fact of the matter is the hobby has come a long way in the last few years, and it's only continuing to accelerate genuinely. The entry costs are maybe a bit more than buying a AAA gaming title, but I would bet that the entertainment value per dollar is just going to be much higher, because the replay value of flight sims is really almost infinite. The variety of gaming experiences range from massive multiplayer combat missions to solo bush flights to parts of the world you've never and probably never will see in real life. And there's just so much that you can do in so many different ways that you can experience a flight sim that it's really hard to run out of things that you want to do. And the hobby provides diversion and immersion and a chance to learn and practice genuine new skills. And I really don't know what more you would want from a hobby than that. So I think that if you've ever thought that you've wanted to know what it was like to fly, I think now is the time to give it a try. So I hope maybe that video is helpful in explaining the state of flight simming and what it would take to get into the hobby. I really hope that this convinces more people to give it a try. I think it's better for all of us the more people who are experiencing this hobby. That's going to do it for me today, so I'm just going to say this is Sidekick, signing off.